So.
Thanks for joining. As you're waiting, if you want to put your name and energy level in the chat, that would be great. Maybe on a 0 to 10 scale, 10 being super caffeinated and ready to go. Hey, Debbie, thanks for joining. Just asking people to put your energy level in the chat. On a 0 to 10, 10 being super caffeinated and ready to go. Rainy weather always gets you a bit. A little bit lower energy. Okay, we'll play with that vibe. They have this maple coffee at Trader Joe's that they only put out this time of year. And I got really excited this weekend, but I probably had too much of it this morning.
That'll get you going.
Energy level of 4. Okay, we got. I'll check my caffeination here.
Well, it's right up 11 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for our 2023 Tuesday Talent Series here at the Fort Collins Area Chamber of Commerce. We're super excited for our session today, Cultivating Cultures of Care, the Power of Compassion at Work, with Katie Huey, Client Success Coordinator with the Trebuchet Group. The Tuesday Talent Series is sponsored by Plant Moran. Plant Moran is among the nation's largest accounting, tax, consulting, and wealth management firms, and provides a full line of services to organizations in the following industries: manufacturing and distribution, financial services, health services, healthcare, private equity, public sector, real estate, construction, and energy. Plant Moran has a staff of more than 3,300 professionals throughout the United States, with international offices in Shanghai, China, Mumbai, India, Tokyo, Japan, and Monterrey, Mexico. In Colorado, Plant Moran has served its Colorado clients for more than 40 years, with offices in Broomfield, Denver, and Fort Collins. Plant Moran has been recognized by a number of organizations, including Fortune magazine, as one of the country's best places to work. For more information, you can visit plantmoran.com. So let's get on to our wonderful session today, Cultivating Cultures of Care, the Power of Compassion at Work. Katie Huey specializes in exploring the intersections of lived human experiences and business needs. She believes the world needs more leaders who embrace the complexities of being human while also striving to make a positive difference in the lives of others. Work need not cause more suffering. Her personal grief story informs both her coaching practice and passion for increased empathy and compassion in the workplace. She holds gentle space for individuals and organizations to come to creative and compassionate solutions in a chaotic world. She also leads workshops and facilitates conversations designed to help people find words in situations where we often come up short. Katie is a graduate of Stanford's Applied Compassion Training, a certified grief educator, and recently completed Blue Mesa's transformational coaching program and is working toward ICF certification. She has worked with leaders and their teams since 2011. Katie, we're super excited that you're joining us today, and I will let you go ahead and get started.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see a few people here in the room, and for those watching the recording, thanks for taking time today to talk about, there's a lot of C's on that slide, cultivating cultures of care and compassion. So for those who are here with us today, if you can turn on your cameras, I'd love to see your faces. I often joke that it's weird to walk into a meeting and if everyone had a bag on their head, and be talking at people with bags on their head. And in Zoom land, that's sort of what it feels like. So if you have the ability to show your face today, that would be great. We're going to have a conversation and walk through some different information just to see where we're headed together. So Yvonne, I'm going to take over the screen share. Is now an okay time? Right. All right, so here is where we are headed together today. I just want to welcome us with a quote from Brene Brown. Compassion is not a virtue, it is a commitment. It's not something we have or don't have, it's something we choose to practice. So that kind of informs our mindset as we flex our compassion muscles together. Also, I really prefer a more informal presentation style, so feel free to stop me with questions in the chat. We're a small enough group here, I think, too, if you want to just come off mute, we can have a conversation as we go. And before we get going, we're going to talk about creating a brave space. We'll talk about some uncomfortable truths about suffering at work. We'll explore the difference between empathy and compassion. And then explore where we get stuck. And if we have time at the end, you'll get a handout about building your own compassion plan, both as an individual and then how you can have implications for your organization. So an hour goes quick. I will try not to talk too fast. I was joking with Yvonne that I am super caffeinated from Trader Joe's maple coffee, and I'll try to slow down. So I'm really glad you're here and where we're headed next. A lot of times during sessions like this, you might hear people talk about creating safe space. And safe is always a really admirable goal, but I have a very different definition as to what keeps me safe than maybe what Yvonne or Pete needs to be safe. So we like to offer a reframe around, in this hour, let's create a container of brave space. And I know that font is tiny, so I'm just going to read this poem real quick. This is by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And she says, "Together we will create brave space because there's no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, and we call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know, and we will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we'll work on it side by side." So for this next hour, in this little petri dish of strangers, we get to be brave together. And when it's time to share, I like just to have some ground rules for the group. It's really important for me that we value and include various ways of knowing. Each of us come to the table with different experiences that inform expectations and our own models of how we view the world. So let's hold space for each of those. I share an invitation to stay curious, speak from personal experience, and try to be present, minimize multitasking. I think too, in the Zoom world, we joke that we have seen toddlers and dogs and naked toddlers. We're all managing a lot, especially in these hybrid workspaces. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself. What else would be helpful that you've seen in sessions like this to add to the list so you can participate fully today? You can either speak out or add something in the chat. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'll take that as a thumbs up. And then I also just want to name that, especially in conversations like this, sometimes it's hard to share experiences. We are recording. Usually I have maintained kind of confidentiality on here, and since this is going to be shared out with the interwebs, just be cautious of what you're sharing with yourself and others, and choosing silence can also be a compassionate choice. Hi, Allison. Glad to see you here. So I think one of the things that I want to start with is this idea of an uncomfortable truth. that in order for compassion to be present, there's also this dark shadow of suffering. And Kristen Neff, who is a compassion expert and a writer and a leader in the field, has this quote, and she says, "Compassion is by definition relational. Compassion literally means to suffer with, which implies a basic mutuality in the experience of suffering. The emotion of compassion springs from the recognition that human experience is imperfect." And a lot of times, especially in business consulting spaces, we hear words that, or I have gotten pushback, that suffering is too strong. We want to keep that at a distance. That belongs in people's personal lives. My role as a leader is to actually look at systems and structures that are going to not talk to humans as whole. But there's a recent article from Zach Mercuro, and he says, a new study found that for over 70% of people, their direct leader had a more significant impact on their overall mental health than their doctor or therapist. A 2021 American Psychological Association study found that 59% of employees experience adverse mental health outcomes because of work experiences. Between 2014 and 2018, rates of depression and anxiety among employees rose by 18%. And between 2022 and 2023, rates increased by 25%. So I think each of us probably has things in our lives that we're carrying that we choose not to share at work, and that's okay. I'm not asking for work to be a vulnerable place where you are bearing all. But our role as leaders and as employees and as coworkers is to understand that each of us probably has some element in our life that's causing a little bit of an ouch factor. Especially post-pandemic, there's perhaps more of a bigger cause for suffering. So in order for compassion to exist, we have to also be brave enough to say that there might be suffering in this space. So this slide has a lot of information on it, and I'm not necessarily going to read it word by word, but a lot of times, I mean, raise your hand if you've talked about empathy in the workplace and what that means to you. Yeah, 1 head nod, 3, 4 head nods. So this column here on the right is talking about the difference between empathy, empathic distress, and compassion. And this comes straight out of CCARES at Stanford. Empathy is the ability to feel with someone. It's that automatic imagination of what it might be like to be in someone's shoes. It can be positive, and it can also be negative. A lot of times we are vicariously experiencing what it might be like to be someone else. Empathic distress happens quite frequently, especially for people like me who are oversensitive or highly sensitive. But it's this self-oriented response to suffering. Perhaps I am imagining your situation to the extent that it's causing me pain. And where that gets problematic is that I might be experiencing more pain than you are because I'm imagining what that could be like for you. I'm going to start using names, and Allison is nodding a little bit, but if Allison's sharing a story with me, I all of a sudden imagine what that would be like for me to be in her shoes, and maybe that's not her experience. This also often results in withdrawing to self-protect, and a person doesn't have to be present for you. Maybe you're hearing a story on the news, and it's causing you to spiral. And the difference then becomes, what do you do with that information? So compassion is a feeling of concern accompanied by a motivation to help. And it's supported by inner strength and resources. And it doesn't have to include that vicarious suffering. So it's, to me, the formula of I see you and I want to do something, and I'm going to do this action as a result. The good news is that it's an ongoing practice and a deliberate exploration, and it's a trainable choice. I think going back to that idea at the beginning that we shared with Brene Brown's quote, we get to choose to do this over and over and over again, and we're going to be imperfect at it. I think too, when you look at your inner resources, there's an element of sensitivity, resilience, courage, and wisdom and satisfaction when you choose to do this over and over again. There's a lot of neuroscience around this, and that often goes over my head. But if you're interested in those resources, I can make some connections for you. But there is a lot of research around the cognitive implications for this. There's a recognition of the suffering, and usually people have some sort of affective reaction in their bodies as well. You can have feelings of warmth or care or concern. And really the key factor here is accompanied by the intention to relieve suffering. So with all of these words on this slide and me rambling at you, what questions do you have here?
I don't really have a question. I think just a affirmation. I think of the stuff on the right hand column. You know, I've had some really big, difficult situations that have happened in my life in the last year, and it's really become a part of like my story of like being in my business and taking a sabbatical from my business. And like, you know, when I went back into the corporate workforce into an HR role, people would ask the question like, oh, why did you step away from your business to come back into the corporate world? And I chose to tell my story openly for a variety of reasons. And I've really had to learn and understand how to navigate the empathic distress response that people would have. And you know, and even like, oh, like you don't need to share that, or like if you don't want to, it's like, well, I know, thank you, I know I have free will, I know I have free choice, like I'm sharing because it's a part of my own healing process. But understanding, you know, like, why am I sharing those things even in the workplace, right? Part of it was to model to people that it was safe to be yourself and share things that you've suffered with, because that's probably something that's showing up for you at work. And so teaching people, so, you know, leaders go first. So you know, kind of have to figure that out.
Yeah.
But like navigating that empathic distress response and making sure that people aren't like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe like what that must have been terrible for you. It's like, yes. And also like all of these beautiful things have come out of it, and making sure that like you're navigating that, not like just like landing this bomb and then walking away from it. I think like taking into consideration when you are sharing a story, or when somebody is sharing something, making sure that there's like a loop. You know, they say like in speaking, it's like when you take people down in the valley, you got to bring them back up. So I really love this slide and the things that you shared about it.
Thanks. Yeah. And, you know, in what you're sharing, I think you're naming some of the fears and the very common reactions that people have in the face of being open and honest and generous with your story, which I think a lot of leaders feel is risky. So, yeah. Any other questions here? Okay. So, there's a slight difference too in this idea of applied compassion. Once you've gone through kind of that quick check in your body of, oh, I'm noticing suffering and I'd like to do something different about it. These are Stanford's 5 elements of applied compassion. And it starts with awareness, the ability to witness the pain of others. And I think I would add, or in yourself. A lot of times as leaders and employees, there's opportunities for self-compassion too. And that can be as simple as saying, ouch, this is hurting me, or ouch, I'm noticing someone else might be hurting in this moment. That doesn't necessarily have to be audible. A lot of times if I'm in meetings or having interactions with my coworkers, I'll just put a hand to my heart. And that can be an act of self-compassion too. And with that is a close pair to humility, that we are, as humans, capable of both goodness and suffering. And I think, Allison, to your point too, like a lot of times people want to keep that story at a distance because they don't want it to have happened to themselves, or we don't want that vicarious experience to happen to ourselves. So let's honor the complexity that we can both be good and have potential and have some power in the suffering. And then also let's witness the pain. So I'm usually using my hands a lot. And then 3 is embodying inner resources and strengths. And this is the opportunity to draw upon our personal experience, both physically, mentally, and organizationally too. I think many of us have really interesting stories during COVID around how we as teams were able to pivot, make adjustments, get scrappy. And I think I would posit that we're still very much living in a time of uncertainty, whether we're talking about the economy or talking about what it means for our teams to be working together again in person. There's a lot of inner resources and strengths that we could make lists on and categorize about what's going well. And then I think number 4 is actually my favorite, of recognizing common humanity. And the phrase "me too," I think, has been co-opted in, of course, a powerful way. But for here, what I mean is just every one of us, even on this call, have experienced some element of like, oh, I'm not alone in this. Other people are feeling this, especially at work when we're talking about things like imposter syndrome or not having the answers. When we look at leadership models, there's a lot of shoulds that get in the way of actually saying, oh crap, I'm still a human here. And how do we honor that humanity, that spirit of resourcefulness, but also tender learning in others? And then number 5 is just the choice to act. And that can be grand gestures, or that can be something as simple as I'm going to put a hand on my heart. When we look at systemic change, sometimes it's putting in a policy, sometimes or maybe it's getting as simple as I'm going to create space on my calendar to do a check-in with someone who I know might be going through a disruptive life event. So in each element of compassion, these are the definitions that continue to bring vitality to this practice. What questions or wonderings do you have about these? Cool. So again, there's a lot of research on the advantages to bringing compassion into workplaces, and these come from the work of Monica Warline and Jane Dutton. They have a book called Awakening Compassion at Work. And when compassion is present, these 6 things increase significantly. The ability to innovate in spirit of a safe space. It's okay to make a decision. Service quality, people know that they can go above and beyond for customers, especially if you think about service industries. How have you seen people at their best and also at their worst? What are our opportunities to help people out? Collaboration increases, and I think that's greatly linked to the ability to trust one another in our imperfect messiness. Employee retention seems to go up when people feel that they are seen and that they belong. They want to continue to contribute. Employee and customer engagement, I think, very succinctly links to that idea of service quality. And then adaptability to change. I think, especially as we look at these last 3 years, there's been a lot of forces at play that are outside of our control. And how do we have compassion for ourselves and others when all the things that we're trying to do maybe aren't working or sticking? We get to be a little bit more resourceful here. And there's a lot of research about these, and if you're interested in that, I can certainly pass those on to you. So just send me a note. And I think it's one thing to look at this and look at the science and look at the stats and say, yeah, of course, I understand this. Like, I want this in my organizations or in my daily life. And at times we still get stuck. So I'm going to move us into what I like to call the yeah buts. a lot of times people have their arms crossed, like, yeah, that sounds really nice, but you don't understand my organization, or you don't know my boss, or you don't know my sister. So again, another quote from Zach. He says, I refuse to believe leaders wake up in the morning and say, hey, today I'd like to be an uncaring leader. Like, very few of us are driven by that. But as you think about your lives and your organizations, what are some of the beliefs that get in the way of compassion for yourself, either at work or in other areas of your life?
I guess I could share that the first one's, shouldn't the suffering of life be separate from the demands of work? And years ago, when I was at Columbine Health Systems, before I came to the chamber here a couple years ago, we started the Work-Life Navigator because we absolutely learned that the suffering of life comes to work. It is at work, and that separation isn't there. Like it can't be. And we not only found did we have our employees who had work-life balance, needs that we could solve. We also had employees who said, you care about my work life. That means something to me. And that
Yeah.
kind of leaves some suffering, even though they may not be taking full advantage of those opportunities. And I think the slide before where it talked about increases retention and then the adaptability is so key, because you can't get to adaptability unless you have the same people who trust each other and can work together. And so it is all really super connected.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit more about what that program looked like? Like, what did that entail?
Yeah, so we started out with a grant with Bohemian Foundation and Larimer County, and then it transitioned to, there's actually a nonprofit called Work Life Partnership, and work life is one word, capitalized life. And we had a counselor who was available. You say 24/7, people aren't always calling in the middle of the night, but available to visit with our employees about anything that was, it could be about their supervisor if they felt uncomfortable coming to HR, but many times it was about housing, food insecurity, life events. I remember employees didn't share with us, but sometimes an employee would feel very, very like they really did want to share. And one particular staff member shared that transition of becoming a parent for her grandchildren, and the paperwork and the rules and all the things that she had to do, and she just didn't want to have to deal with it, and yet it was really affecting her ability to come to work. And the Work-Life Navigator worked with them, held them accountable.
Yeah.
So said, this is what you need to do, didn't do it for them, but help them to walk through that. We also found that many of our employees really struggled with filling out their tax documents, right? And doing their taxes. And so we had every year, and we probably had 80 to 90 employees who would come in that 2-week time frame to have VITA volunteers help them fill out their taxes for that year. And I can tell you the retention of those employees was over 90% when we helped fill out their taxes. And many times they just were afraid of the government and the paperwork. It wasn't that they had very complicated opportunities, but they just felt unsure of themselves in filling out that paperwork. So it was lots of things that we learned. Over time, we learned about how much food insecurity we had amongst our employee base, and our owner was very generous in helping the food bank and their opportunities, because we knew that would directly affect our workforce. So we then got data about our employees that then we could use to make decisions about what we were doing with our HR policies with our employees.
Yeah, that's such a multi-layered, beautiful example of putting compassion into action. Thanks. Is that a hand? No, here, just, yeah, go ahead.
Karen's got their hand up. Go ahead, Karen.
I think for me, it's really finding compassion with myself. It's very hard because a lot of times I'm like thinking, especially during COVID, I think I was the only one feeling whatever I'm feeling because no one could be in my shoes. But allowing myself to share to people I love what I'm going through, even though they might not be in my shoe as a Chinese American, but they were willing to have compassion for me in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for naming that. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. Pete, did you have an add-on?
Yeah. Yes. I think it relates to that and what Yvonne said. I guess when I look at these common beliefs, the observation I make is that, this belief that suffering should be separate from the demands of work. And then these things like, I'm not a therapist. It's a result of people not feeling comfortable or being appropriate to try to fix suffering that's happening. And the last four bullets, they're kind of like fixes, right? But the point more so is to be able to listen and just like understand people as people. And so it seems like the misconception that comes along with these common beliefs is that there needs to be some, like, it just people miss the mark on what the point of bringing the compassion to the workplace would be in the first place, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're all going to have different answers to that question. Allison?
I think some of the things that I ran into being in HR is that leaders would often be afraid to get into these conversations because they were like, oh, I might cross a line that I'm not supposed to cross. And I think that like the thing I always tried to convey was, sure, like those conversations might reveal information that then means we know protected class information that might open up the door for some kind of HR compliance, something or other, right? Whether that be now we know something about a person's disability or, something about some kind of protected class, something or other. And what I always said is, like, if you do the right thing and care for a person, typically, my opinion is and I'm not a lawyer, but that like a court of law is going to ask, like, what was the intention behind what you are doing? Did the company provide training to managers on what they're supposed to do? Did the manager kind of loop in HR and make sure, like, is there anything we're supposed to be doing, right? Like, is this an FMLA situation? Is there some kind of, protections of some sort that this person has the right to? And I think a lot of times managers like will avoid having these kinds of like deeply personal conversations because they're afraid of the legal compliance risks associated with it. And I often say, like, if you're doing the right thing and caring for your people, like those aren't the litigious people probably, right? And kind of like shifting their mind to understand that. And then maybe even helping them understand like where there are places for them to, be more open and vulnerable with their employees so that they feel like it's safe for them to do it as well as an employee. I think like leaders go first, right? So those were some of the thoughts that were kind of coming to my mind as I was hearing the others talk as well.
Yeah. And I think that naming of like fear of what could go wrong or am I overstepping is very, very real. And even as I have conversations with leaders about this, I always am like, but I'm not an HR person. Like, I don't know what the rules are. But I think if you take it up a level is legal policies and fear culture hold us back. And maybe it's not even legal policies, it's organizational policies. And I think fear is often at the root of that. So yeah, this is really good discussion. And, I almost want to pick Yvonne's brain too, having insight as a leader of an organization with a lot of employees and a lot of possibilities for protecting both the organization and people. I think there are real implications there. And another quote that comes from Monica Warline is this idea, hang on, come on, slides. that compassion requires customization. And so if we're really paying attention to what people need, you have to be open enough that you can't have a blanket policy, because even all 6 of us on this call, or 8 of us, we're all going to have different responses to what care and compassion means for us. We recently started using clean questions, and this is an idea that comes from Caitlin Walker out of the United Kingdom. But if I ask you, Pete, to explain, think about a frog really quick. What kind of frog are you seeing, Pete?
You'd like me to share that?
Yeah.
I'm seeing a small green frog.
And who sees a frog differently when I said the word frog? Yvonne's leaning in to unmute.
Yeah. I saw those big ones that have those pads that are yellow, those big kind of waxy looking big old frogs when you said it.
Yeah, and Allison.
Kind of saw like a bullfrog, like kind of
Yeah.
a stodgy, like big old bullfrog.
And so I think this is a fun one too, in terms of like, it's just one example, but even this word compassion, that's going to mean something different to me than it is to you. Employees are going to have different responses to what does care look like to you. So I think there's some also possibilities in using metaphors with your employees around what does care look like, what can get in the way. And oftentimes it's easier to ask about like, how do you like to be celebrated, or how do you like to be recognized? How do you like to receive feedback? But I think if you're willing to be a little bit vulnerable and ask that question too, of care for you in this situation looks like what? A lot of times in disruptive life events, managers will say things like, oh, take all the time you need. Or what's another one? Oh, there are just no words for situations like this. And like, first off, I don't really think people mean take all the time you need. Cool, I'll talk to you in a year and a half. Like, grief doesn't go away, even in a year and a half. There's just a lot of things that we say that get tricky. So those clean questions can help with that. Yeah, Allison.
One thing that I notice is like when people are in a difficult situation in their life, because sometimes like the manager might ask a question like, what do you need? And the person might not be able to access that information. So one of the things that I've loved really teaching managers is like, come up with like 2 or 3 options that might be something that will spark the thinking for that person, instead of like, what do you need? Or like, take off time. I think sometimes people that are in a difficult situation, like they actually don't want to not be at work, right? Like it gives them a place to go. It gives them structure. And also they may be neglecting their self-care. And so giving the managers and the leaders tools of like sample things that they could say in conversations, and even getting them to understand like, hey, when you're overwhelmed or grieving something, are you thinking clearly? Right? So you're expecting that person to give you answers to questions when they're maybe not even thinking fully clearly, because put yourself in their shoes. Would you be? Right? And kind of just guiding them and giving them some tools of like, put yourself in the shoes of a person, not so that you can feel their suffering, but to understand like, well, what is it that you might feel like could be beneficial? And, like, do you respond the same way your spouse responds, right? You need 2 different things. So it's kind of this customization thing, and giving like, I think metaphors, like you were saying earlier, Katie, they're so powerful because it gets us to be like, oh, right. That makes perfect sense. But I find like people, when you say, what do you need? It's very much like a blank stare. And like a helplessness, like, I don't know what I need. So giving options is really powerful.
Absolutely. And I think another helpful framing, this comes from my colleague Liesl Merites, and she's in Indiana. But she often talks about our role as managers is really to be an empathy and compassion first responder. of how are you assessing the situation? How would you call for help? How would you outsource this? You're not going to sit and do CPR on someone without calling first 911. You might get tools in the middle to help get this person out the door. And of course, that's a drastic example, but I think really looking at what is within my control in this organization as a leader and what can I do? And then how do I offer that in a way that's not frustrating for both parties? I think to your point too, some of those open-ended questions of like, well, if I say, how can I help? And then all of a sudden, Debbie says, well, I need 6 months off. Then me as a manager, I have to say, no, I can't do that. So it creates this like horrible spiral of versus like, okay, Debbie, I know that we're going to give you this week and we're going to touch base on Tuesday, and then we're going to make a plan for the next week after that. So I think that's a great segue into this next section too. We have choices in our responses, both as individuals and in our organizations. And when I lost my dad in 2016, I remember sitting in a hospice support group, and they said, there's going to be 4 types of people who show up for you. There's going to be helpers. So these are the people that are going to show up and maybe rake your leaves or take out the trash, get you groceries. There's going to be distractors, the people who want to show up and maybe go to a movie with you, take you on a hike. They might not have the emotional fortitude to sit with you and cry. But then there will be people who have the emotional support. They're going to be the people who are checking in on you. And then there's going to be the 4th person, and this one's maybe the hardest to stomach, is those people who you thought would support you, who don't show up at all. And when I think about my own experience, I can put 3 or 4 people in that category. And that's painful, and that causes suffering too. And in organizations, I think it's important to look at what are the roles and routines. What are we asking people to do that maybe, to your point earlier, Allison, like maybe we just don't have the emotional fortitude to do all parts of my job right now, but I can continue to write a blog post. I can continue to do X, Y, and Z. I think there are systems that we can put into place, like the work-life program that Yvonne was sharing. That's an excellent example. And then work culture is, what do I know as a coworker that that's okay for me to do for someone else? I think Southwest does a good example of this, or a good job of this, where it's like they know where they can go above and beyond for their customers. And it's easy for them to say yes to. A lot of times people are worried, like, oh, if I show up at the hospital with their kids and bring them something, like, what are the boundaries where it becomes okay, and where do people have to ask for a yes or a no? And then actions and stories. I think as you're thinking about building into your meetings, what are the stories of lived out values and examples where people are cared for, and how do those get highlighted? So I'm going to upload what I'm calling a compassion action plan into the chat. So I'm really bad at multitasking, and I'm going to pause and not talk while I do this real quick. Where did my chat go? So this little handout has these categories in 2 columns. And you can use this. I'm going to give you just 5-6 minutes to think about, where are you already doing some of these things well? And what are some things that you would want to try? And then where in your organization are you also doing some of these things well? We use appreciative inquiry at Trebuchet Group, looking at first, where are you awesome? And then what are some of the gaps? Rather than, oh, what's missing, because that can feel overwhelming. I guarantee each of you probably has a unique example of how you're showing up with compassion. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on this call. So I'm going to play some music just for about 5 minutes. You can use the hand or not, but do some thinking about where this is going well for you. And to jog that, here are a few questions that can help. Recall a time when you experienced or observed compassion being given and or received. How did you respond to make an impact? And how did you know that this response was a compassionate one? Let's see if I can do a screen share change here. We'll come back together and just probably at 10 till. You guys hear that? Cool. you're ready to come back together, just put a note in the chat. If you need a little bit more time, that's okay too. Give it about 1 more minute. All right. So I'm curious, I'm going to stop the slides here. What rose to the surface for you in your reflections?
For me, like certainly the questions that you asked, like to kind of foster our thinking, I was really able to think to specific examples of when I experienced compassion and kind of like just shared very openly and how that was received. And the thing that I think then the thing that then came into my mind was like thinking of the times where there was a totally opposite response. And so I've navigated and experienced both of those things. And then when I think about like the difference in those organizations and what was important to those organizations, like it makes sense. And like the people that had those differing responses, if I look at the organizations, like it really makes a lot of sense. And then when I think about like as an individual, it's very much kind of like how I've evolved as an individual and how I respond, whether I'm in an HR role, which I was, and now I'm back into my consulting business, but like I feel like how I show up as an individual is very much informed by what I feel like I wished other people would have provided me in my times. And so I just think it's really interesting to reflect on that. So
Yeah, thanks. I can so relate to that passion for helping others out of lack of what you experienced. And I think to that point, like we try to look at what's going well, but the question of what's a story where you've had a miss, where a leader missed you, where someone screwed this up. I think each of us have a story there too. Debbie, you've been kind of quiet. Can I call on you?
Yes, of course. What kind of came up to me as thinking through those questions was how this, I do work in HR, so I'm approaching some of these situations that this does really help to kind of neutralize whatever is happening and allow for setting boundaries. And I feel like coming from HR, responding with that compassion or even having others come in with that compassion, that you are meeting on the same ground and that's really important.
Yeah. Thanks. Who else?
I could share one. Coming from working in long-term care for 38 years and having folks staff members sometimes, but mostly our residents and sometimes their family members having difficult moments, having aggressive moments, having we were a lot of us were trained in crisis prevention, right? And CPI Institute things. And so I came to the chamber and I wasn't here more than 3 weeks, and we had somebody at our front door. We're open all the time. We're the place to come and learn information, and very needing of services way beyond the scope of the chamber, and the staff not really knowing what to do and spending 2 or 3 hours on with the situation, and not feeling like they could or should call the police or activate services for this individual, right? And then it happened again a few weeks later, and then we sent this person out of our building with resources to the post office, which is where they needed to be. And they came back, and then they came up and down the street, and they were at Otter and they were at Blue Ocean. And again, many people involved. And so I really, from a systems standpoint, we instituted an event process, and where we record what we're learning and what happened so that we can learn from it, but also we can capture, like, this is the 3rd time this individual's been in our building with the different staff here. And then I did a CPI training over a month's time frame. And what's interesting is just the other day I thought, we haven't had an event. Now I'm going to probably trigger one, but
Knock on wood. Yeah.
we haven't had an event in months. And a part of it is I think we know how to handle it now, but also people have figured out coming to us isn't going to get the support that you need. Like, we're not the place that you should be coming to for those sorts of situations and opportunities. And I really feel like the compassion part was giving staff permission to be afraid, but also to act. Like, you can call the police. We had somebody with shooting off firework things in our parking lot and lighting big fire things, and they had nothing to do with us, but landed in our parking lot. And so protecting them and making them safe, but also that the people that were coming to us needed services we couldn't provide, and we were doing the right thing for them too. And that we were a bit mixed up in how that all works. So I feel like individually and as an organization, the whole system change thing was super, super important. And I feel like I filled out the report and I know what we're doing, and then we talk about it and we walk through it and own it. And so it's been quite a big change. And I hadn't thought about it till you asked the question. I'm kind of like Allison, it just sort of triggered it in me to write that down. So thank you.
For my own learning, the acronym CPI is what?
Crisis Prevention Institute.
Okay.
And so it's really about, like, the only thing you can control is yourself.
Yeah.
And so I remember right before I left Columbine, an individual who was, by family decision and by court, was no longer allowed to know anything about his mother. And he knew she was somewhere in our system and demanded to know. And yet by law, we couldn't tell him. I mean, it's a terrible position to put caring people in the middle of.
Right.
And he came to the front door of the management office and pretty much screamed at me for probably 15 minutes. But there's a certain stance that you take, an approach that you do. And pretty soon he just looked at me and he goes, well, you don't know nothing, and just walked away and got in his car. It was completely de-escalated. And I just followed what CPI had taught me, and it really is successful. And at least he was de-escalated, could get in his car and maybe make a different plan, because the plan he was on was not helpful to him. And he threatened to call the sheriff on me while I was standing there being calm with him. And so after I spent that 15 minutes, it became very apparent why the family was protecting mom from this individual, of course.
Sure.
So it's complicated. It's complicated in our lives and our world, but that CPI was super, sadly enough, needing to be done in healthcare at this point in the world. So
Yeah. Well, and there's several things I just really love about that story. Is one, giving employee guidelines around what good looks like and what is expected and what they can say yes to and where they need to ask for help. And then the other, especially in light of like the man coming to you, sometimes compassion needs to be fierce. And that's a Kristen Neff phrase too. But compassion doesn't mean bending over for the sake of other people's negative behavior, but rather standing in your truth of what you need to do in service of others. And I think as leaders, we walk that line very carefully. I mean, but your choice to kind of stand and quote unquote take it in service of what you've been trained in and in service of what the organization needs is actually the most compassionate choice. So For others who are looking for more examples on fierce compassion, Kristen Neff has a book on that too. Thank you so much. I know we're reaching the end of our time here. I'm going to put just one more prompt in the chat as we're closing. And my question for you today is, what's one thing you'd like to try to bring more compassion to your organization? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to just put up my contact information too. It's been a pleasure exploring this together today. And I know that this is messy work. We're imperfect humans and we're going to make mistakes. But in our closing, let me figure out how to do a quick screen share again. I like ending just with this meta kindness meditation in our work. May you be safe, may you be peaceful, may you be kind to yourself, and may you accept yourself just as you are. As you're doing this work, there's a lot of space for self-compassion too. My name and email and Instagram handle is there at the bottom of the screen. And I would love to have just a 20-minute conversation with you about what's going well and what could be better for your organizations too. So please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to look at some of these responses here. Safe to brave. Yeah. Yes, Allison, I do know where you're at now. Would love to connect. And if there's any lingering questions before we wrap up, I can hang on too. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you all for joining us this week for our Tuesday Talent Series. Next week on the 10th, we have Dr. Phyllis Resnick, quite a change from this week's session, a professor at CSU who's going to talk about healthy labor markets and quality jobs in Northern Colorado. So lots of data, lots of great information, and she's really involved in their Economic Institute, I think they call it, lead economist for the Colorado Future Center at Colorado State University. So that'll be super exciting. So we will give you the slides and the recording for this as well in the next couple of days. So we hope we see you next week and have a wonderful day and absolutely be kind to yourself.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.